So again, my name is PaulDeMaggio. I graduated Cal Poly San Luis Obispo about 12 years ago as a bioresource and agricultural engineer. I've since focused on irrigation and irrigation alone for the last 12 years or so here in Jackson County and in some extent the greater Applegate area. So most of my work has been in this region. I've seen over about 300, 500 site visits over that time period of various farms and ranches and various irrigation systems. I don't claim I know all of it. There's still some areas that I haven't touched on, but I am available for anybody in the area for questions after this or anytime. You can give me a call and I can help to pinpoint some areas and some resources for you to answer some questions about water resources. This presentation is going to be focusing on water scarcity, water security, and then what you can do now to hopefully be resilient through droughts later in the future. I'm going to touch first on some agricultural water resource management terms. We throw out terms like efficiency, conservation, and we're going to talk about what those mean, how to optimize irrigation water use, irrigation system improvement options on farm, and ditches and conveyance systems. I've done whole presentations on that in the past. I'm just going to touch a little bit on that. And then ag water quality is something that I'm focusing on now and in the near future. And so I'll touch on that. And then our fundings and programs, which cover a little bit of what OWRD and what Cora mentioned earlier. So irrigation water management is what all this, in my mind, boils down to. How are we managing our irrigation water? It's also called irrigation scheduling. And the goal of irrigation is to grow a crop. So we look at how best to do that. And it all goes into the soil. I just picked up this nice handout from OWRD's table over there, recently published by Oregon State University and their irrigation specialists. And it has some nice diagrams here that I'm going to steal from my next presentation. But for now, this is the one I've got. You can see here on the left side, you get too much water, you're over-irrigating, your plant is going to wilt. You get too little water, your plant is also going to wilt. So we're looking at this sweet spot here, right here, to try to, that's all irrigation management is keeping that soil in that ideal area for those plants to be nice and happy. That means we're here, you're not overfed, you're not underfed, you're getting a feeding every couple hours. That's going to make you the most happy. That's what we want our plants to be. So too much water or too little water is not good. And then, when to start irrigation. Do you start it when the plant is already wilted? No, you start it based on the soil moisture. The soil moisture is really the baseline of where all the knowledge comes from on when to irrigate. So you can't do that unless you're actively feeling the soil or putting in some soil moisture sensors. And then how long do you irrigate for? That's the more complicated piece. That depends on a lot of factors. But at the end of the day, you want to irrigate to where your soil is not too wet.
That's a technical, boy.
Yeah, it's super technical. I can talk for 5 hours about that, but I won't. So irrigation water management for ditches and conveyance and diversions is a little bit different than the on-farm management. On-farm is about growing the crop, getting water on the crop, and then irrigation water management as a whole, like what Oregon Water Resources does as part of that scheme of irrigation water management basin-wide, ditches and conveyance and systems. Who here is on a shared irrigation system or a shared ditch? So one or two. Who here irrigates out of a well? Okay. Who here has a pump out of the river? Okay. So good. So I've done some presentations where it's all been about shared systems and shared water resources on ditches, where management is really key to even be able to get water to your field. But in this class, it seems like there's a lot of folks who have the ability maybe to get water to their field when it's available. There's not a lot of barriers in the way between getting water on the field, but I'll still touch on this too. So in this scenario, when you got water coming out of a ditch, which is typical in the Applegate, there's a lot of irrigation ditches. When do you open your head gate? That's a big thing. Do you open it up right when you're allowed to, April 15th every year? Not necessarily, because what if it's going to rain? There's rain in the forecast for the next 2 weeks. What if your soil on all the irrigated land is already saturated? Why are you going to open up your head gate too early? Save some water in the system, only open it up when you need to. How much water to divert down the ditch? That's a water rights question, but also about how many acres are actively being irrigated that season. So the water right associated with your ditch could say 3 CFS for all the acres if everything on paper was irrigated. But that's typically not, in reality, the scenario. Usually, some of those acres are going through property transitions. They might not be irrigated that year. Some might be doing other things and not irrigating their full area. And then so the amount being put in the ditch should really be based on the acres that actually need the water and are irrigated. And then when and how long does each person get to irrigate? There's different things, rotation schedule, on demand. Rotation means, like with the bulge pond example, you only get water on your ditch once every 2 weeks. That's rotation, that's fixed. You can't really change that. On demand means whenever you feel the soil getting dry, you can turn on your pump and you can water your crop. That's the most flexible, generally the best way to get the most crop growth. And then how much water to release from the reservoir for use downstream. So Applegate Reservoir releases water into the Applegate for use for irrigators. When are they supposed to do that? It's not too critical in this one, but in the Bear Creek area of Talent Irrigation District, Immigrant Lake, Howard, and Hyatt, they really have a big conversation before they open those gates from the reservoirs every year. Because they want to know anytime they open it up too early, it's going to waste that water. Yeah, quick question, but I'll also take questions afterwards too. Yeah.
Okay, quick question. So when you're checking for the water content in your soil, are you digging down a little bit, or are you just grabbing handfuls?
Yes, so I was expecting that question, and there's a lot of good resources on our website, but also in this little book, this green book back there, it's also available online. It has some good pictures in there about that, but the biggest thing is just digging in with a shovel, a thin shovel. They also have special soil augers that'll dig a little hole down, and you want to dig the water, get the soil where the roots are. Irrigation efficiency on farm. So what this means is you're trying to get more crop growth per drop of water. So you turn on your pump, you're getting water to your crop, you want that water to grow your crop as efficient as possible. The difficult engineering formula is water used divided by the water applied. And it's important to be as efficient as possible and use water without waste. And that's part of the water law. That's what all of us neighbors want to see other users doing. That's very important. Inefficiencies can be caused by runoff. Runoff means water lost on the soil surface. Water lost below the root zone means that if you got a little plant with a little root system and you're irrigating and that water is going way down and then going out, you're losing that water from the crop. That water is ultimately making it somewhere else, but on-farm efficiency is low if you're over-irrigating your small crop. Evaporation off of the soil and plant surfaces, a lot of water gets lost on the leaves of the plants. And so that's why drip irrigation or some other under-tree irrigation is more efficient. Wind drift, it gets windy in the afternoon. One really good reason not to irrigate with sprinklers in the afternoon. And then water used by weeds. So there's a lot of weeds, blackberries, thistle, different things that come up in the spring. Those are all sucking water out of your soil, and you're just going to kill those weeds. You're wasting that water that should be stored in your soil for the crops you want to grow. And then inefficient irrigation can lead to erosion, runoff of fertilizer and nutrients into waterways or into groundwater, poor crop yields. And then basin-wide efficiency versus on-farm efficiency is example of where you're using too much water, you're up high in the watershed, that water's going deeper into the soil. It's not necessarily being used on your farm to grow your crop, but it's seeping out later underground, getting back into the river, being maybe picked up by someone else downstream and used and reused all the way down. So on a basin wide or watershed wide, you can be fairly efficient as long as that water is being reused all the way down. It's important to know that because if everybody is really efficient up higher in the watershed, whereas historically they weren't, so they were flood irrigating up higher in the watershed, excess water is going down and being reused. If all of a sudden they all switch to drip irrigation, now there's going to be a lot less water coming down through the system in the middle of summer because they were very efficient. So efficiency doesn't necessarily mean there's more water available for folks in the basin. And we saw that here in the last couple of years when a lot of folks switched from flood irrigated pasture to drip irrigated hemp or cannabis. Here is an aerial picture. It's pictures of flood irrigation. This is one of our main clientele. This is called contour flood irrigation. There's a ditch and you put a tarp in the ditch. It backs the water up, water spills over the side of the ditch. It's difficult to control. You can see all those dry spots and wet spots. There's a million ditches in there. There's cows in there. That picture on the bottom right is one of our water quality studies we did where we were quantifying the amount of runoff coming off of the field and figuring out how polluted that water would be. So there's a lot of water coming off of the field. That's all water not being used. So that's inefficient on-farm irrigation. But I don't want to give flood irrigation a bad rap. Flood irrigation on uniform, laser leveled or laser graded areas can be fairly efficient and almost as efficient or more efficient as sprinklers, and it uses less pressure and it doesn't require filtration and it kills all the rodents. So there are some benefits of flood irrigation, but it's very difficult to get to that well-managed flood irrigation in this area. This is more of a Central Valley, California type thing. Or not this, but efficient flood irrigation. This contour flood irrigation on steep soils is typical in our area. Here's some examples of efficient on-farm irrigation systems, drip systems on grapes, under tree sprinklers, micro sprayers on orchards, center pivot sprinkler system here on any number of crops, alfalfa, hay, any other row crops you can fit in there, corn. That's the thing you see when you're flying over Nebraska, the big circles, center pivot, very efficient. So as I kind of mentioned before, but the irrigation efficiency paradox, efficient irrigation, efficiency of irrigation doesn't mean less water is used. That first sentence is the worst. I misspelled that one. But what I really mean is less water used is less water used. So efficient irrigation doesn't mean you're actually using less water. And we see this in some of these recent references in the Scott Valley, which is down in Siskiyou County, right down there in California. They've got a groundwater management area, and they were all trying to get really efficient systems, thinking that they were going to conserve groundwater by switching to efficient systems. But what that really means is that everyone's just growing more crops with the same amount of water because they're being very efficient. So you only get water savings if you actually have water savings. So on to water conservation, which using less water, water conservation, a lot of Cora's examples of stuff around the house have been shown to have water conservation, use less water because you're just growing less area, less water intensive crops. So more water, the goal with this is that more water remains in the system for other uses or for other irrigators. So if everybody is conserving water, then that means more folks can grow on more acres, or more water is available for domestic uses or for habitat uses. The allocation of conserved water program I've done a little bit with, and that seems like a great program to save water for habitat, and it balances out water usage. Some areas are imbalanced. Everybody's using water for agricultural irrigation, and there's not enough water saved for habitat. And so finding that balance based on the basin is what this is all about. It can't be assumed. I'll talk a little bit more about deficit irrigation, which is a great way to reduce the amount of water used while also being optimizing the resource. Crop type and irrigated areas are key factors in this. So optimizing water, how to get the most bang for your buck with your water system. So it's not just about being totally efficient, it's about, how much should I use to where I'm getting the most bang for my buck? How much water do I need? Depends on your goals. Is the goal for aesthetics? Then you don't want to irrigate your grass too much and have it grow too much. Then you're just cutting it down way more, and that's a lot more labor and you're using more water. At least that's how I feel in my grass area. I try to irrigate it as minimal as possible so it stays green and it grows a little bit without having a lot of weeds come through. So I'm optimizing it. And that could be, 50 to 75% of what the literature tells you you should be putting on your lawn. Maximizing yield, generally 90 to 100% of your irrigation amount. That's in the literature on how much you should grow. And again, that there's a lot of information about there about how many inches of water or how many gallons of water to put on the plant. And that information is usually about maximizing the yield and the growth. So that's not the minimum amount, that's usually the maximum yield amount. You can really reduce that amount that you see on paper a lot of times. With drip irrigation even, they found that when you switch to drip irrigation, because it's so efficient and you're spoon feeding the crop a lot of water, or a little bit of water very often, it actually uses more water than it would if you were irrigating it once a week on sprinklers. So you're an efficient system, but you're actually growing more and potentially using more water to get more yield. Optimizing more or less means maximizing your net income. So maybe about 80% of the water you need for that crop is all you need to put on. And show it here on this curve. So max water productivity, what this shows, is there a laser? So you get the most crop yield by putting on your 100% crop water requirement. The crop needs a certain amount of gallons, you put that on, you're going to get the highest yield. But as you notice on this curve, it's not linear. So at some point, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Right. So at some point, the curve starts to flatten out. And so which means that to optimize our water use, we want to be in about this area of the amount of water put on. So a little bit less than your 100%, less than your maximum yield, and you get relative crop yield for that. So 60% of your water applied, you could get 80% of your yield. But you do 80% of your water applied, and you only get 90% of your yield. So that curve starts to flatten out. And so that's the general rule about optimizing water, deficit irrigation, is you can use this much water or even more water, but you're not getting extra yield, and you're kind of wasting your time and effort and your pumping costs and your resource to really not have as much benefit. So to be as effective as possible, being in this range is really important in terms of growing crops. Here's another graph about optimizing water, max net income, about your sweet spot of water applied. Increased water use by the crops does not equal the same amount of net income. And so this graph is actually showing a scenario in where by reducing the amount of water used from 100% down to 70%, and this person was able to sell off their excess water to somebody else who wanted it. So sometimes there's transfers, and you can actually sell someone your excess water to use. And the amount of water they were selling boosted their net income to this. So they found that by using 70% of their water, selling the rest, they came out pretty good. This scenario is selling the water was not available, and they found about using 90% of their water was the optimum use of that water. Never using more water than your crop needs is never going to get you any more money. It's just going to have runoff of your fertilizer. It's going to bring water down into the root zone, carry nitrogen away. That could flow into a nearby well and contaminate it. So the goal is to, use less water than what everyone's saying to use, and you should get by just fine, as opposed to using it and being afraid you're not under irrigating, as opposed to a lot of people over irrigate because they don't want to under irrigate, but it needs to be the other way around. Under irrigate as enough as you can, feel the soil, and go from there. So good management is really important. That's really the breadth of everything. Reduce losses, be efficient. Grow crops appropriate with climate, water availability, and soil conditions. I read a recent study about the Hopi Native Americans down in Arizona who have grown corn where it rains 8 inches a year without supplemental irrigation. And they've, over 2,000 plus years or more, come up with this crop that can handle that. They know their soil. They do what they can to maximize that 8 inches of rainfall. Here, we get, over 20 inches of rain. So why would we plant something that requires too much water? We should really plant something knowing what our climate is, what our water availability is, and what the soil conditions are. Soil holds a lot of water, so that's really important for crop conditions. If you talk to any vineyard or grape growers, they will know all this stuff really well about the terroir of the soil and the type of grapes grown and the root conditions and what climate they can handle. But in terms of grasses and pastures, there's some new grass coming out that are more drought tolerant. Even in the urban setting, there's new grasses that are, instead of turning brown when they get dry, they stay green. And so there's a lot of new stuff coming out about choosing the right crop to be able to withstand through drought. Storing water during wet periods for use in dry periods is a great way to optimize the resource. We do that here in the Applegate. The Applegate Reservoir holds a lot of water. There is still water available for more ponds in this area, and you can talk to OWRD about that. The other way to store water in your soil is through organic matter and mulch amendments, improving the water holding capacity of that soil. For about one Cord mentioned this too, 1% of organic matter increase is about 20,000 gallons of water per acre. From an agricultural perspective and a larger scale irrigation perspective, that's enough water to grow something for about an extra week in the middle of summer. So it's not going to save your bacon by adding on that 1% organic matter, which is sometimes really difficult to do, but it's better than nothing. Mulching and covering that soil prevents any evaporation or losses that come off of the soil. You want to keep that water in the soil so that the roots can extract it through the crops rather than being wasted to the atmosphere. Regenerative and permaculture practices, I forgot to put permaculture in here. Those are great ways. The whole concept of that is to keep water up on the hillside during wet periods, store it in the soil or in reservoirs and ponds, and then be able to slowly release that through the system during the dry periods. And you can really boost that soil moisture, keep the soil ideal for longer to boost crop production. And ponds and tanks. Regulated deficit irrigation is really what I was touching on those last couple slides. Focus on highest producing lands. I was just rereading in this little book here about the good rule of thumb is that in a drought period to switch to about 80% of the acres and focus on those, on your highest producing 80%, and leave the other 20% unirrigated. And that will really weather you through some of these drought periods. That, along with regulated deficit irrigation and just keeping the crop alive, really helps to optimize water. And then keeping a water management journal. That should be really first on here in terms of good management. I really like seeing when larger irrigators keep a management journal. They can say, I irrigated this day, I irrigated for this amount, and then I had this much yield. Without that information, it's really difficult to optimize the resource and to know how you can adjust and how much water you need and how much water you're using. Optimize on shared systems. Kind of what we're doing now is education for water users, governance structure, open communication with the water master is really important. Equitable availability of water is really what we're all about, so that one person with their well isn't using all the groundwater. We're trying to share that water so that everyone can get what they need. Higher cost of water really usually results in more efficiency. So in some areas, like in Texas, they don't have a lot of municipal water, so they have really strict regulations where you can only water once a week during your trash day. And you can't water after like 10 in the morning. Otherwise, you get written up and you get a fine. And that is based on necessity and the cost of water. In our area, the cost of water isn't so high, so we don't need to pay for that extra regulation. They've got like 10 guys driving around all day, checking and issuing citations. And that's like a need-based. So it's nice that we don't have to do that amount of regulation, and it's hard to get ahead of that. It really happens when you run out of water, then you develop a system, unfortunately. But resource. I think, Tom Fay is in this area. It used to be Ewing Irrigation, but Dave Bowers from Siskiyou Ag. There's a couple other folks in this area that do irrigation consulting. So there's many different systems. Who here is looking to get like a new on-farm irrigation system for this coming season? All right, so a couple. So yeah, we can chat afterwards, but otherwise everyone seems perfectly happy with their existing system. We want a flexible system. We want something that's cheap. We don't want too much labor to operate it, and that's really the goal. There's a lot of wiggle room in there about what to put in. And again, flood irrigation is okay if managed well. And I'll just guide through here. So there's some on-farm irrigation systems in terms of why people choose what they choose on their farm. A lot of us are moving into an existing system, which is totally fine. It doesn't need to be changed if it really doesn't need to be changed. And generally that's based on crop requirements. If you've got a system set up for hay or pasture and you want to put in an orchard or row crops or vineyard, you're going to need to change the system. Otherwise, the existing system you have is probably okay to get you by. If you got a flat square field, loamy soils, then you can really do whatever you want. Green light, go get whatever system you want. In our area, we got more on the bottom where it's sloped, irregular shaped fields next to a river, clay soils, or even really sandy soils. You need to pause, take a moment, talk to maybe one or two irrigation contractors, get their opinions on what to do. Irrigation ditches in our area, most of them are earthen ditch systems. Ton of maintenance required for those. A lot of rodents get in there during the off season, and then when the water comes back in, the water flows out these rodent holes, which can cause erosion, leakage, and at the worst thing can cause blowouts. Managing those systems is difficult. So ways to address that is to do liners. This is a picture, it's hard to see, but that's a concrete liner there's a giant crack right here, and there's a bunch of rodent holes back there, so water was just seeping under that concrete and piling out. These aren't all, and the reason I show that is because even if you fix your ditch, there's still going to be some maintenance required. But it's pretty expensive to do some of these things. Piping your ditch, this is Gold Hill Irrigation District. They just put in a big culvert around this bend, and the reason they did it was because they didn't want to get sued for a ditch blowout because someone built a new apartment complex right below their ditch. So the reason justified the cost, and then they were able to do it. Otherwise, they're okay with a little bit of leakage. A lot of these systems were built, and that's okay if there's some leakage. As long as you're getting, 80% of the water you need, and you're optimizing your labor for the amount of water you're getting, then that can be okay. A lot of the programs through OWRD, Allocation of Conserved Water program, focuses on piping and lining the canals because that is really a win-win for folks. You don't have...
What kind of lining?
So this one up here is concrete. It seems to be, I heard this study from Texas where they analyzed like 300 miles of canal of all different liner types, and they found the best one, longest term and least cost over the lifespan of the project, was to do a rubber liner, like a pond liner, and then cover that with concrete. Because then the liner doesn't get ripped or torn through maintenance activities or through wildlife. And then the concrete protects it over time. The concrete's going to crack and leak, so just doing concrete is okay to prevent some blowouts, but over time, in about 15, 30 years, you're going to have to really be patching it every single year. So yeah, good question.
So how about that clay liner powder you get for some ponds where you seal, would that work on ditches, or is that too expensive?
That one works pretty well in areas that are wet all the time and areas that aren't exposed to the atmosphere. So like in a pond or a ditch bank, inside the ditch bank or inside the pond dam, that can work well. But if it's on here, you can see this is dry and exposed. If you have that clay liner, that's just going to crack. And then it takes a while for it to come back together when you put water back into it. So it's got to be covered. I don't see a lot of clay or bentonite in open ditch systems, but good question. And I think Rourke Ball is going to be talking about ponds. That's a great question for him. I know he's got a lot of experience with bentonite on ponds and ditches. So ag water quality, I've got this handout in the back. Some of our funding comes from Oregon Department of Agriculture for agriculture water quality. And that means doing practices to prevent sediment and erosion from getting into local waterways, to prevent pesticides and nutrients entering into waterways or wells from irrigation runoff, and to prevent warm water from getting into those streams, which is caused by irrigation runoff or lack of streamside vegetation. And that's a OAR reference number in case you want to look it up, 603-090-000 through 0120. And ODA, not us, have the enforcement authority to go out and issue someone a citation or tell them they need to fix something if they're having a water quality management issue. And all that information can be found in this packet here. They're complaint driven. So I'm not going to say go turn in your neighbor, but really that's really what drives the whole thing. Yeah. And a lot of it is, someone cleared a whole area by a riparian area. They got their cows. All their cows are in the riparian area, mudding up the creek. That's not okay at all. Someone's storing all their manure next to the creek, or they dump their manure into the creek. That's not okay. They need to be turned in, and something needs to be done. Most of the time, it's like, hey, here's what's going on. You can't do this. And it's like, okay, thanks for letting me know. We'll put in a fence. We'll put in a water trough. We'll let the cows drink from a different source. And then everything's honky-dory. Or we'll put in some riparian vegetation to prevent sediment from getting into the waterways. So our agency, Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District, is tasked with helping to voluntarily get folks to comply with this through many different cost share programs. The program I'm working in now is by Eagle Point. It's called the National Water Quality Initiative, and we're working with Medford Water Commission and all the source water drinking area. And then they've defined that a lot of the water coming into their drinking water intake is polluted from agricultural runoff, a lot of flood irrigation, cattle pasture in the area. And that causes some sediment, high temperatures, organic compounds to get into the water. And so we're working voluntarily with us, and then in our CS, there's some paperwork back there about how to get some of these folks to improve their grazing management, improve their water management, improve their flood irrigation management, to clean up the water, which is a public use, public benefit of that water, to make sure it's not dirtying up everything else. Historically, they did similar stuff to mining operations when mining was really big in this area and in Northern California. A lot of the mine tailings were coming off and fouling up people's pump intakes or municipal water intakes. And they said, no, that's not okay. You can't just do any mining you want and dump all your stuff in here. There's got to be regulations to that. And now we don't see a lot of mining in our area, really because they cracked down on it. So similarly, with water resources and flood irrigation and different things in the agricultural space, there's still a lot of room for improvement to make sure that people downstream aren't suffering the consequences of your actions upstream.
Excuse me, who's dealing with the illegal pot growing? Who?
From a water perspective or from a...
Water, not so much the sucking up the water, but water pollution, because there's a lot of abandoned sites that are probably toxic, so who gets to...
On an abandoned site, I don't know the best answer for that one yet. We're working on something, but...
How about for bulldozing the mountain for water runoff?
Yeah, that can be an ODA thing, or it can be a Department of Environmental Quality if it's related to some type of construction. Environmental quality requires a construction permit to prevent erosion coming off of a construction site. So that's a tried and true thing that people will get on that. But yeah, as far as the cannabis one, I went on one compliance deal where they were irrigating out of some greenhouses, and then they had the waste from the greenhouse going through a pipe and dumping right into the stream. And they tested it high for nutrients. They didn't really test for all the things. And so their strategy was, instead of dumping it in there, they were gonna, respread that water out onto this field so that the grass can use the excess of nitrogen or phosphorus that was coming out of that system. Okay, so I'm on to funding and programs for water management and efficiency. Cora's got a nice program. Like I said, we've got funds and staff resources focusing in certain areas for the next probably 3 to 7 years in that area. And that's just how we can optimize our resource and try to clean up that area that's been identified as having the most potential uplift for habitat enhancement, for domestic water use improvement, and for agricultural and the economy. I'm currently working on with Josh, the agricultural specialist at our office, on a ag water quality rebate program, which would cover everyone in our county. So unfortunately, that funding couldn't be used outside the county, but any landowner, taxpayer in the county that wanted to put in something that would reduce ag water quality issues from either their irrigation or livestock. And that would be pretty small, but it would be something worthwhile to check in probably in June or July when we work on that. And there'll be a limited pool of funding, and then we can still always come out for site visits and offer free technical assistance. NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they're like the federal arm of us that have a lot of money to hand out. They used to do a lot of the on-the-ground technical work. They used to be called the Soil Conservation Society, and they've switched to being called NRCS. And then now a lot of times the soil and water conservation districts do a lot of the on-farm work or some other agency does on-farm work. And then NRCS provides a big portion of funding directly through the Farm Bill. And so they have a bunch of different programs. Those programs are back there, and the contacts are back there on the table. And then other larger funding pools exist: OWRDs, Allocated to Conserved Water Program, OWEB, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Bureau of Reclamation. They're extending their reach not just to irrigation districts, but also to irrigation associations. But again, it has to prove those three benefits that Sue mentioned. And sometimes that can be difficult in a system that maybe has a lot of water, or it's not severely limited to drought each year, or it doesn't have the endangered species nexus. But yeah, talk to us about various programs if you need to. So, any questions? I've got some other slides after this. I know we're doing pretty good on time, so good job. Yeah, questions?
What is used to qualify an area as a riparian zone? Is it a soil test, or what is it?
I think it's the county setback. I think it's 50 feet from the center of the stream, and it's depending on what type of stream it is. But really anything, the way I think about it in my non-riparian trained brain, is anything close to a creek or water that runs in the wintertime is like riparian area.
So
If
it is seasonal.
Yeah, if those trees and vegetation growing along there are greener and bigger in the summertime, then you can bet that they're getting water either from the subsurface water from that riparian area or directly from the surface water. And so that would be considered like the riparian area, riparian habitat, because it's not being supplemented by irrigation. It's not dry land. So yeah, there's some regulations about that. Clint Nichols at our agency, who is in, in our handbook back there, that we've got all the contacts for us and then other agencies. And we did this back in 2020. It needs to be revived a little bit, but the main contacts in here, and you can just call our office and ask about riparian questions too, and we can get you set up. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Nate.
Paul, just to clarify that, the setback is from the high water mark, not from the center of the stream.
Oh, good, thank you.
ODF just redid their forest plan, so all the setbacks have changed. It's based on the size of the stream, whether there's some on it, and what that stream is feeding into. That is timberlands, but it is like, the regulations have changed. So if you got if you got a book from a year or so ago, it's probably not up to date right now.
All right, good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So for those of us who aren't green thumbed, I assume there's like a moisture meter that you could buy to, if you don't know what the right moisture is, you can stick it in it and tell you.
There is a soil moisture meter. You got to know how to read it and how to install it and how to maintain it with batteries and different things. That's really good, soil moisture meters. There are some cheap ones that are like $50, $100, and you pop them in and then you got to measure it. And it tells you a number. And you're like, well, what does 47 centibars mean? So those still have to be calibrated too. In this little book here and in this resource, they go through some additional soil moisture monitoring, different things. But again, some of the irrigation contractors haven't put in soil moisture monitors for high value crops like grapes or orchards. A lot of times they have big networks, soil moisture sensors, to determine when they need to irrigate. Based on their past journaling of irrigation, they know they got to hit this number by this time so they can get the most yield, and that's really important. If you're irrigating out of a pond or some other limited water source, knowing the soil is super important. So I think it's a good investment. I've put in a bunch of soil moisture monitors. They really help out because you can put them at different levels. So you put one at 4 inches, 12 inches, 24 inches, and you can really see the whole level of the soil every day. It can graph it for you, and it's the best. I recommend them for everybody, but a system like that could be $1,000, $2,000 with a rain gauge. And talk to an irrigation contractor, I'd say first step, get one in. But I still like using the hand method or doing the auger method, because you can feel it pretty quick and say, okay, it's dry or wet. And the level of certainty they have on these is, 25 to 50% dry. They're not saying, oh, it's 43% dry, or it's, you're trying to get it to be about 50 to 70% dry, and there's some different references in here and different references elsewhere about, does it stick to your hand, does it form a ball, what type of soil is it? And yeah, being out there messing with the soil really helps. Yeah.
So, Paul, the Jackson County Land Development Ordinances, Chapter 8 and Section 8.6 has information on stream corridors and riparian habitat. So, Chapter 8.
We will get you guys to write an update for this book. So yeah, I guess in this book too, we've got some pages on irrigation, understanding your resource, what different types of irrigation there are, flood irrigation, different things. A bunch of info in here about what Cora was talking about, stormwater management, different things with urban management. And we got a couple minutes, and so I was looking this up. This is the blue, this was kind of confusing, but this is, the whole pie is everything that U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manages in our basin. The blue pie that's been cut out and turned into another pie is the Applegate Reservoir. And the Applegate amount of irrigation available, 26,000 acre feet. 40,000 available for fisheries enhancement, and then some additional conservation carryover. So there is quite a bit of water available for irrigation. When I look at that value acre feet, I didn't really cover that in the terms, but that means you're putting a foot of water over your whole acre or over 1 acre. So that means they could fill 27,000 acres 1 foot deep. Water used for crops is based on inches of water used. So 12 inches there. And that could be, in this area, a typical pasture or hayland might use about 2 to 3 feet of water per season. And so,
Supplemental water after rainfall?
Yep. Well, unless you get some good rainfall in the spring and you can store that in the soil and then use that water. But really, that's the amount of water is really needed to get a nice, good crop. Here's some other information about Lost Creek and Applegate. I thought it was interesting, the Applegate, the total storage capacity is 70,000 acre feet. And these are elevations that they can get to 63% of the reservoir's usable capacity, meaning they have to keep some water in the reservoir. They can't drain, they usually don't want to drain the whole thing out. And that's typical on a lot of reservoirs and ponds. You can see Lost Creek, it has almost 100% of it can be drained out. Immigrant and Howard are quite a bit less than the Applegate. Applegate's pretty big, and it's a really good water resource we have in this area to carry us through droughts. As long as your groundwater source is near the river, or you can pump directly out of the river, it's a really good resource. Without that, there'd be less water available, generally later in the summer. Here's a curve of the Applegate we were talking about. So why are we releasing a bunch of water? Why can't we capture all the water? Is because if we kept it high here above this red line, red means bad. If you kept it high above the red line and you get a big spring flow, then you could fill up the reservoir and have a flood event. So they keep it low, and they're actually kind of above here, maybe because they're trying to change the rule curve, or they have better predictable capabilities of weather now than they used to. They're actively trying to manage these reservoirs better to be able to be more flexible based on modeling. But we can still only model out, 10, 14 days at the best. And a lot of times, the amount of water falling in a basin is difficult to measure. It could be, we're going to get between 1/4 of an inch and 1 inch of rain over this whole area. We don't know. Here's something about, this is the Applegate watershed, and this is the water availability analysis from Oregon Water Resource Department website. And this is what they can help you through to determine if there's water available for storing water in the wintertime. Yes, 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 all the way through May. June, you can't use or store any more water. And that's what, generally, I'm probably saying this all wrong, but that's generally what I look at, is like, yeah, if all those are no, I know that, okay, there's probably no water available. If there's some yeses, then yeah, you could probably apply for a pond permit or store water in the off season to carry you through some droughts. And from a water security standpoint, that's probably what I would do if I was living in the Applegate, is try to collect as much water in the wintertime, either in the pond or in the soil, to be able to use later in the season. I know, I'm just talking, I put these in here just in case we had extra time, and I think we do, but if anybody wants to leave and do whatever they need to, feel free. This is water rights, so this is Roosh. We're about over here somewhere, and this is publicly available water right data. I use quite a bit for water analysis or water irrigation design. Before I help someone with an irrigation system, say, okay, do you have water rights or not? I look at this, or I look at some other systems and say, okay, this person has a surface water right. Their little triangle for that, if I clicked on it, it would show, oh, they're pumping directly from Applegate River. Great, that's a good source, generally a year-round source. You know, go for it. You can plant whatever crops really you need. If they're over here and they've got their green triangle here and they're pumping out of Forest Creek, maybe Forest Creek dries up every July or June. Probably not the best idea to plant peaches that need a lot of water in August. You know, do something in the spring, tailor your irrigation system accordingly. Purple means groundwater rights. You can click on any of these and it'll tell you the flow rate used for the groundwater or the flow rate here. This hatched is probably surface water with a supplemental groundwater right or supplemental water right attached to it. So just because you have a water right, you can still add another water right from another source on top, just in case you don't have access to your first water right anymore. And I see that's a good way to kind of weather the storm in certain scenarios where you don't have that water available from the small creek or the ditch. But if water's not available, now you have water available from Applegate Reservoir or from some other source. But yeah, so that's that.
So what is the minimum, is there a minimum water right, like the amount of water you have to use? What's the minimum to get a water right? Like if you just had a little orchard, or if you weren't like full-time, big-time farmer?
I guess anything above a half an acre,
Okay.
because then you'd be potentially growing it commercially. If you're trying to irrigate an acre, then you can't with your domestic well.
Right.
So you need to probably get a water right for that half acre.
Okay.
Quick question,
Yeah.
I was told that it was illegal to water your like tomato crop from your well to sell at the farmer's market. Can you clarify that?
I would say yes.
Yeah, if it's commercial from groundwater without a water line, whether you're selling it at the Saturday market or you're selling it to the grocery store.
Is that information widely available? Because when I said that, I was just about hung, drawn, and quartered.
Yeah, we can give you one of these water rights marine handbooks, give you the statute or the rule if you want. It's pretty clear that non-commercial irrigation is what's allowable from groundwater without a water right.
There needs to be some public education at the farmer's market. Not by me.
Any volunteers for that one?